Some firearms are engineered to win wars. The rifles we are examining today, however, became absolute nightmares. Welcome to iReview. In this episode, we are analyzing weapons so fundamentally flawed that they jammed in active combat, suffered catastrophic structural failures, bankrupted defense budgets, and, in one unprecedented case, were entirely erased by the collapse of a sovereign state. These were not low-budget prototypes cobbled together in a garage. These were multi-billion-dollar defense projects, spearheaded by top-tier engineers and entrusted to frontline infantry marching straight into disaster. And the most fascinating anomaly? One rifle on this list operated flawlessly, yet still ranks as one of the most monumental military failures ever conceived. Join us as we break down the engineering behind the most disastrously designed rifles ever manufactured. Number 1. The Carcano M91. Imagine fighting a modern, brutal war holding a museum piece. The year is 1935, and you are bleeding in Ethiopia, gripping an Italian Carcano M91. Let's dive into one of the most controversial, poorly timed, and deeply cursed military rifles ever fielded. Mechanically speaking, the Carcano M91 was designed by Salvatore Carcano and served as Italy's primary infantry rifle through both world wars. It was chambered in the 6.5 by 52 mm cartridge, a round initially designed in 1891. The weapon featured a standard Mannlicher-style bolt and a 6-round M-block clip. However, the raw blueprint is where the positives end. It possessed one of the worst triggers in military history: heavy, gritty, and wildly unpredictable, making aimed fire at distance a matter of sheer guesswork. Furthermore, the rifle had a fatal sensitivity to dirt. Unlike the British Lee Enfield, whose superior design allowed it to push straight through the trench mud of World War I, the Carcano jammed relentlessly in filthy conditions. Subjectively, relying on this weapon feels like holding a death sentence. The 6.5 by 52 mm round was pitifully underpowered for the vast open engagement distances of North Africa. But the true, terrifying curse of this mechanically questionable weapon wasn't its abysmal trigger or its intolerance to mud. It was entirely financial. Between 1891 and 1945, Italy manufactured an absolutely staggering 2.4 billion rounds of 6.5 by 52 mm ammunition. That insane scale of production is the sole reason the Italian army was trapped with a rifle they deeply despised. Frontline commanders desperately begged for heavier calibers, fully aware that the weapon was obsolete. Yet, when an empire is sitting on billions of rounds of stockpiled brass, replacing the rifle becomes a terrifying political nightmare. In my view, the Carcano M91 represents a bizarre curse born of economic terror. The weapon didn't fail purely because the engineering was completely unworkable. It failed because it was a catastrophic casualty of bureaucracy. It stayed on the battlefield because saving money mattered far more than saving lives. It is the ultimate tragedy of warfare when the men on the front lines are forced to pay the ultimate price to justify an inventory spreadsheet. If you want to own a piece of this cursed history today, you won't have to break the bank because of the massive surplus generated during the world wars. A standard Carcano M91 generally costs anywhere from $250 to $400 on the current firearms market, depending on the exact variant and physical condition. While it remains an incredibly affordable piece of military history for modern collectors, its true historical cost was unimaginably high. Number 2. The Gewehr 41, Stalingrad, Winter 1942. You are freezing to death on a brutal Eastern Front, holding a weapon mathematically engineered to get you killed. This is the story of the German Gewehr 41, a firearm that perfectly illustrates the lethal gap between what a weapon promises and what history actually demands of it. Let's break down this catastrophic, mechanically questionable nightmare. The German Gewehr 41 was originally meant to be the Wehrmacht's ultimate semi-automatic infantry weapon. It was chambered in the devastating 7.92 by 57 mm Moser round and produced in both Walther and Moser variants to dominate the battlefield. However, the rifle was cursed before the first blueprint was ever finished. The Ordnance Office issued an insane mandate. Engineers were strictly forbidden from drilling a standard gas port into the barrel because bureaucrats feared a loss in accuracy. They demanded a semi-automatic rifle but legally banned the only proven, reliable method to actually build one. Forced into a corner, desperate engineers resorted to a bizarre, bang-type muzzle capture system. This relied on a heavy trap at the muzzle to catch exiting propellant gases and forcefully cycle the action. On a pristine testing range, this complex mechanism worked perfectly. However, in the frozen, muddy, blood-soaked hell of Russia, the Gewehr 41 was an absolute death sentence. The weapon's true curse was its fatal over-engineering. The intricate muzzle trap instantly choked on its own massive carbon fouling. Worse still, field stripping this impractical nightmare required specialized tools that a frontline soldier taking heavy artillery fire simply did not have. The sub-zero weather paralyzed the delicate bolt assembly, causing catastrophic failures to feed, extract, and cycle. Documented combat reports screamed the brutal truth. This cutting-edge weapon was dramatically less reliable than the ancient bolt-action Kar 98K it was supposed to replace. In my view, the Gewehr 41 represents the ultimate tragedy of arrogant bureaucracy overriding engineering reality. It is infuriating to see a weapon deployed with vast resources that actively punish the soldiers trusting it with their lives. The engineers weren't necessarily incompetent. Their hands were tied by people looking at blueprints instead of trenches. The most insulting part of this entire curse is the sheer avoidability of it. By 1943, the command finally relented, drilled the simple gas hole, and built the vastly superior Gewehr 43. The G41 was a massive, lethal mistake born entirely of institutional stubbornness. Despite its utter failure on the battlefield, the Gewehr 41 is a highly sought-after prize for modern firearms collectors. Because it was relatively short-lived, deeply flawed, and rapidly replaced by the G43, surviving models are quite rare. Depending on the manufacturer, Walther, or the exceptionally rare Moser G41M, and its physical condition, current auction prices generally range from $4,000 to $10,000. Pristine numbers matching examples can easily exceed $15,000 to $20,000 plus dollars. It remains an incredibly expensive artifact of a spectacularly avoidable disaster. Number 3. The Pedersen device. What happens when you build the ultimate secret weapon, but history just cancels the apocalypse? Let's delve into a weapon that was flawlessly manufactured and ready to change the world, only to be violently deleted by peacetime bureaucracy. This is the tragic story of the Pedersen device. Officially designated as the U.S. Pistol Caliber 30, Model 1918, the Pedersen device was a bizarre, mechanically ambitious hybrid. It was meticulously engineered to violently transform a standard bolt-action Springfield M1903 into a trench-clearing nightmare. In under 60 seconds, a trained soldier could rip out the bolt, slot in this device, and instantly convert a slow-firing .30-06 rifle into a rapid-fire semi-automatic platform. It fired a proprietary .30 caliber pistol cartridge fed from a massive 40-round magazine. The military took this capability so seriously that General Pershing officially authorized 65,000 units and 65 million rounds of ammunition. The curse of the Pedersen device wasn't a flaw in its engineering. It was brutally unforgiving timing. The Army classified the project as top secret, absolutely terrified the Germans would discover the devastating assault capability planned for the upcoming 1919 Western Front offensive. The factories roared to life, and the weapons were built, locked, loaded, and waiting in the shadows. But then came November 11th, 1918, the armistice, the apocalyptic 1919 offensive that the device was meticulously built for, never happened. The true curse was enacted when the peacetime army simply refused to pay the ongoing costs for a proprietary pistol cartridge. They immediately recalled the 65,000 units and ordered a literal mass execution of the hardware. The expensive manufacturing tooling was crushed, and the devices themselves were violently thrown into blast furnaces to be melted down into raw slag. In my view, the Pedersen device is the ultimate ghost of military history. It is deeply frustrating to look back at a flawless, legendary design that history simply refused to let fight. Unlike other weapons on this list that actively punished their operators through terrible design or cost-cutting, the Pedersen device was brilliant. 17 long years later, the military had to completely resolve the semi-automatic infantry requirement with the adoption of the M1 Garand. The fact that this incredible piece of engineering was turned into scrap metal simply to satisfy a peacetime budget makes it one of the most tragic what-ifs of the 20th century. Because the military's mass destruction of the Pedersen device was so incredibly thorough, fewer than a dozen original units actually survived the blast furnaces. Due to this near-total extinction, the device is now considered an absolute holy grail among military firearms collectors. Today, if a verified surviving Pedersen device, especially when paired with its specially modified Springfield M1903 Mark I host rifle and original accessories, hits the auction block, it commands an astronomical premium. You can expect current market values to range anywhere from $25,000 to over $50,000, heavily dependent on its mechanical condition and historical provenance. It is a massive modern price tag for a weapon that was deliberately erased by the very era that commissioned it. Number 4. The CSRGM 1915 Showshot. You are a French infantryman in the freezing bud of the Champagne sector, autumn 1916. You are carrying a 20-pound death trap that is actively trying to kill you. This is the story of the CSRGM 1915 Showshot. It was supposed to provide squad suppressor fire. Instead, it delivered the most notorious mechanical curse in the history of trench warfare. Let's break down exactly why this weapon was such an unmitigated disaster. Because the 8mm level cartridge was semi-rimmed, it refused to stack straight. To compensate, a desperate design committee created a highly bizarre, mechanically questionable half-moon magazine with massive open cutouts along the side. Because France needed weapons instantly, they stripped production from actual gunsmiths and handed it to bicycle factories and auto parts makers. As a direct result, precision tolerances completely vanished. The ultimate tragedy occurred when the U.S. procured 16,000 Shawshots, hastily rechambered for the far more violent .30-06 Springfield round. The magazine geometry was utterly wrong for the American cartridge. The fatal flaw of the Shawshots magazine was that the open side faced directly downward into the liquid mud. The filth poured straight into the delicate action. The curse of the Shawshot is pure consequence. It became a heavy 20-pound magnet for trench mud carried straight into deadly machine gun fire. For the American forces, feeding reliability plunged from abysmal to literally non-existent. U.S. troops were essentially handed a structurally compromised paperweight, while the British wisely carried the vastly superior Lewis gun. This was not just ignorance on the part of military planners. The High Command possessed the French failure data, but intentionally prioritized cheap spreadsheets over human lives. In my view, the Showshot represents one of the darkest types of military failure. It wasn't just a flawed prototype that failed on a sterile testing range. It was a known, verifiable disaster, continuously forced into the hands of desperate men. Bureaucrats gambled the lives of soldiers simply to meet immediate production quotas, mass-producing a weapon that actively betrayed the user every time they pulled the trigger. Despite its infamous reputation as one of the worst machine guns ever fielded, the Showshot is a highly prized historical artifact today. Because it is a fully automatic weapon, live transferable NFA models currently range from $8,000 to $12,000 on the firearms collector market, heavily dependent on originality, condition, and wartime provenance. Deactivated DEWAT versions or mechanically compromised curio and relic examples can still easily fetch anywhere between $3,000 and $6,000 at auction. It is a steep, modern price tag to own what was once considered the ultimate trench nightmare. Number 5. The Heckler & Koch G11. What is the ultimate curse? Imagine investing 2 decades and $1.2 billion to create a flawless sci-fi firearm, just for history to violently delete it. This is the story of the Heckler & Koch G11, a weapon that achieved the impossible right before the world decided it was no longer needed. Let's break down this alien artifact. In 1969, West Germany faced a brutal problem infantry hit rates were dangerously low. Heckler & Koch's answer was a rifle that completely abandoned traditional ammunition. The G11 was chambered for the .473 by 33mm DM11 caseless cartridge. With 0 brass cases and 0 extractions, Heckler & Koch had to invent a proprietary propellant block that wouldn't cook off in a red-hot chamber. The internal mechanism was a bizarre mechanical masterpiece capable of firing a 3-round burst at an absolutely blistering 2,200 rounds per minute. This astronomical cyclic rate allowed the entire bolt cycle to complete before the shooter ever felt the recoil impulse. By 1990, after 20 years of grueling development, it conquered every hurdle and passed the strict Bundeswehr acceptance trials. A massive order for 50,000 rifles was officially signed, and NATO observers were closely watching, fully preparing for it to potentially replace the M16. Subjectively, operating the G11 was like holding the future. Firing it was effectively delivering a 3-round shotgun blast with the felt recoil of a single trigger pull. It wasn't just a rifle, it was a technological marvel. But its curse was entirely out of the engineer's hands. On October 3, 1990, German reunification occurred. Suddenly, the crushing economic burden of absorbing the shattered East German infrastructure drained the entire defense budget in just 90 days. The contract for the 50,000 rifles was instantly canceled. The G11 never had a Stalingrad, and it never jammed in freezing mud. The engineers closed every single gap, but history simply opened a new one. In my view, the G11 represents the most heartbreaking type of military failure. It forces us to ask, which is more dangerous? A rifle that fails because the engineering was wrong, or a rifle that succeeds at everything except surviving the exact moment history decided it wasn't needed? The G11 is a stark reminder that the gap between what a weapon promises and what history demands is always wider and more expensive than anyone calculated when the order was signed. It was a flawless triumph of human engineering, brutally executed by a peacetime spreadsheet. Unlike the other rifles on this list, you cannot buy an Heckler & Koch G11. Because the initial military order was abruptly canceled before mass production could begin, only a small number of prototypes and pre-production test models were ever manufactured. Today, these surviving examples are heavily guarded and locked away in exclusive military and corporate collections, such as the famous Heckler & Koch Grey Room in Germany or various military history museums. As a legally restricted, fully automatic prototype that never entered the civilian market, the G11 is practically priceless. It remains the ultimate, unobtainable phantom of modern firearm history. Every cursed weapon on this list highlights a fundamental disconnect between what defense contractors promised and what the battlefield actually delivered. The G11 solved the engineering equation perfectly, but history simply erased the need for it. That brings us to the ultimate question for you. Which curse is worse? A rifle that fails because the math and mechanics were wrong, or a flawless design that succeeds at everything except outliving the era it was built for? Let us know where you stand in the comments. Make sure to subscribe to iReview for the real, unfiltered breakdowns. These rifles were heavily funded, intentionally designed, and ultimately remembered for their catastrophic costs. The real lesson here? The gap between an engineer's promise and history's demand is always wider and far more expensive than the ink on a government contract could ever calculate.